I'm Tom McCabe, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our November 2025 First Friday session. Founded in 1993, SASH works to promote, facilitate, and disseminate research into the rich history and heritage of soccer in the United States. You can find us on the web at ussoccerhistory.org and on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, /X, and Blue Sky. A reminder that the SASH website, so ably maintained by Ed Farnsworth, has a digital archive featuring video clips of American soccer history and heritage. We encourage you to support our ongoing crowdfunding campaign to digitize even more material. It's not Johann's Cruyff turn. You could say it's SASH's digital turn. And all our sessions are available on YouTube and as podcasts, thanks to Brian Quarstad. You might be working on something that you could present at a future First Friday. If so, we encourage you to reach out. All ideas are welcome, as well as a variety of formats, like today's presentation or maybe a panel discussion. If writing is more your thing, then we welcome contributions to the website on any and all areas of soccer-related history. Reach out with questions. If you're not yet a member, you can join SASH on our website. Please renew if you are a current member. Just click the Join SASH tab to be eligible to receive our newsletter and participate in all activities as we head into another World Cup year. I'd like to welcome our speakers who discuss what would become Inventing the Boston Game, Football, Soccer, and the Origins of a National Myth in a sidewalk conversation outside an academic conference. You could say that they've been chasing pavement for the last few years. Published by the University of Massachusetts Press in 2024, it's taken us too long to get authors Tallec Marston and Mike Cronin to join us. It's worth the wait because today is an anniversary, the 162nd anniversary of that famous, or maybe infamous, Oneida ball. I say that because that round ball kicked up quite the fuss down the ages. Kevin is the current president of our society and is a senior research fellow at CIES in Switzerland and a visiting lecturer at the Montfort University in Leicester, England. Mike is the academic director at Boston College in Ireland and is professor in BC's Irish Studies program. He's an expert in Irish and sporting history. These fine gentlemen and scholars will first talk, limiting their remarks to anniversaries and soccer origin stories. But there is so much more to discuss, and hopefully we can delve into some of those areas in the Q&A to follow. For now, over to you, Kevin and Mike.
Thank you so much, Tom.
So I'm going to begin this strange tale. If we can go to the picture of the monument and the old men, Kevin.
I'm going to pull these up. There we are. All right, can everyone see that?
Yep.
Very good.
So this is a strange monument on Boston Common. It looks more like a headstone, I suppose. They're on a nice sunny day in Boston. If we move on to the old one, Kevin. So this is 1925, November 1925. We have 6 fine-looking old men and a monument. What is the monument? So this is a monument to the Oneida Football Club, which these 6 men and the man in the inset played for. And they played their games on Boston Common in the middle of the Civil War between 1862 and 1865. And as the monument says, their line was never crossed. On the rear of the monument, there's the names of 15 players, the teammates. And critically, the big claim on the monument is that this marks the playing field of the first organized football club in the United States. Now, some provisos as we go along about this process of monument making. This is the only monument on Boston Common, of which you're familiar with it. There are many. It's the only monument put up to somebody or a group of people by themselves, paid for them by themselves, and when they were still alive. Everything else on Boston Common commemorates people who had died, and more normally the monument was put up by the city. So if you move on, Kevin. So if you look at the top of the monument, the critical thing here is the ball. So when we talk about the first, or the monument does, the first organized football team in the United States, what game are they playing? And clearly this ball is, or looks like, an American football. So were they playing American football in 1862 to 65? Probably not, because the game hadn't been invented. That doesn't really emerge till into the 1870s. And the key thing, if you can move on to the next bit, Kevin, is the Oneidas themselves. We know what ball they played with, because in 1922, they donated it to the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities. And as you can see here, it's a round ball. So there's something going on there. They know they've played with a round ball. They've kept it, luckily, for 70 years in good condition, donated it to a museum, now historic New England, and yet on their monument, they have an American football. And this is part of the tricky process that we cover in the book of memorialization and what if they choose to memorialize. So as you imagine, these boys were schoolboys in the 1860s. They're all attending one school, Dixwell School, which essentially was a school wealthy boys were sent to prepare themselves for the Harvard entrance exam. And fully about 70–75% of the boys we identify, or they identify as being their teammates, do progress onto Harvard. By the time we reach 1906, these men have made their way in the world. Many of them have passed away. Many of them become extremely wealthy and powerful in business and politics. And they gather for a dinner, and they've been reminiscing about what they did in their youthful days. And James DeWolf Lovett, one of the men, pens this book, Old Boston Boys and the Games They Played. Now, critically, it covers all kinds of different sports games. Their sledging in the snow, their kind of sports they do on water, and there's only a brief section of a few pages on their football game. When you read it, you'd struggle to take a group of boys out onto a field in a contemporary world and recreate that game, because it's almost as if they're not sure what it is they played in the 1860s. So if you move on, Kevin. So one thing we have to remember is, who are these boys? So these boys, as I say, they're at an elite school. They're preparing for Harvard. They are living on the kind of wealthy hills of Beacon Hill, the suburbs, rich suburbs of places like Milton. And they are the sons of the Brahmin class. Their fathers, grandfathers have made their fortunes out of industry, the railways. They're making a lot of money out of the Civil War. And these boys, many of them will enter adult life with very large trust funds, will make more money from investments themselves. They are a powerful group. They're members of all the best clubs in Boston. They will sit as adults on the boards of Harvard, of the Massachusetts Historical Society. They are men about town with power and influence. So if we move on. So this is them in 1922, when they give the ball to the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities. A perfectly preserved ball. It's a rubber ball, probably made by Charles Goodyear or patented by Charles Goodyear. And it's quite remarkable when you think how we journey through life and how we lose things, things break, we give things away, we move house. Yet these old men had managed to keep a ball they've played with as young men. So move on, Kevin. And their commemorative efforts don't stop with their ball, with Old Boston Boys. In 1923, they approached the I suppose, legacy school that came out of Dixwells, Noble and Greenough, and they asked to erect a plaque on the wall of the school, which commemorates their captain, Gerrit Smith Miller. And they also publish another book, which is a kind of an appreciation of the life of Gerrit Smith Miller, their team captain. And it's not a big event, it does make the papers, but it's interesting to kind of social groups who are there, people like Archbishop Lawrence, also a teammate, and so on and so forth, that they're manipulating and pushing their story, that they did something significant with football into the public mainstream. So we have a ball, we have 2 books, we have the first monument by the time of 1923. Next one, Kevin. So this is a monument finally erected in 1925, the one with the American football at its top. And to show in a way their power, this cultural capital that comes from them being significant men in the city of Boston, they present to the Massachusetts Historical Society the typescript, which is shown here on the right. Now, this is quite an interesting document because not only do they deal with their memory of the games they played, but also it's acknowledged by Walter Camp and others in letters they've received that, in fact, those people, those luminaries, acknowledged the Oneidas were the first football team. There's also contained in a manuscript details and information that's come from Rugby School, who'd recently celebrated the 100th anniversary of William Webb Ellis picking up the ball and running with it. Same kind of idea of commemoration. I think critically in this document, the monument that's erected in 1925 has 15 names on the back of their team. By the time they produce this document in 1926 to be put into the Massachusetts Historical Society, they've increased the number of their teammates to 52. And it's a who's who of Boston society. People like the politician Roger Wolcott. There is state governors, state representatives, bankers, one Secretary of State. It's a real who's who of not just Boston, but how this generation kind of made it. And they're claiming these people. They did all go to Dixway School, but they're claiming these people as their own, as one of them, as one of their team. Next one, Kevin. So you're now going to take up the story, Kevin.
Thank you, Mike. So picking up essentially from where the monument has established a basis for a history and ancestry of the game of football going back to the 1860s. This is where the story gets interesting and complex, and it shows the complicated relationship that that history has with time, and how things become manipulated and used. Particularly, we have the idea of a usable past, and I think that's really a nice place to begin from. Is, you know, by the time the Oneidas have all died and passed away by the 1940s, they're all gone. The story is there, the monument's there. They've deposited all this material in archives, in books, and libraries, and their story no longer belongs to them. And so, what will posterity do with their story? And this is where the story gets interesting. So, in 1948. There's many of you may be familiar with a journalist named Milton Miller, who published regularly in the New York area. And he had a column called the Soccer Shots, which recounted a lot of the ongoing activity in the soccer scene across the East Coast. And in 1948, he published a piece that had a very interesting little bit that just noted the First National Bank of Boston gave a boost to soccer with its November promotional piece in the form of a blotter, which depicted a scene in color of the first soccer football team. Now, so he's making a description of some soccer football team in the Bean City, so in Boston, and it was known as, surprise, the Oneida Football Club. And so there's an initial statement that's made. Well, wait a minute. This legacy, apparently, of the Oneida Football Club might have a different story to it. So I'll get there we are. The ink blotter in question, which I'm pleased to say I'll show you a little. It's here as well. Is a wonderful image, as you see on the screen, of a bunch of boys kicking a round ball, playing with red silk handkerchiefs wrapped around their heads, with probably some rough and tumble play. It looks like some tackling, very primitive in terms of just teenage boys running around and having fun and exerting testosterone. But in 1948, the story is all of a sudden shifted from an American football story to apparently a soccer story. And the U.S. Annual Soccer Guide, which is published in 1948, shortly after Miller's his column, notes at the bottom that they bring the story in. On Boston Common, there is a weather-beaten stone. So we're making reference now to a monument that says, on this field, the Oneida Football Club was first organized. And so it immediately credits the Oneida Football Club of Boston as being the originators and the kind of starting point and an origin myth of soccer in the United States. So this is kind of curious in a sense, because we know that the monument has an American football on it. Now, what's really going on here? As the story continues over the 1940s and 50s, no one in the soccer community has picked this up at this point, really. No one is really aware of it. And in 1960, for example, the officially printed rules by the Federation give a timeline. It's a wonderful timeline of all the old dates, going all the way back, as you see, to colonial times. And we even go through dates in 1862, which is surprising because, as apparently we know from the Oneida's own story themselves, they were playing in 1862. But the American soccer community has not yet imagined or reimagined that the Oneidas could be a part of their legacy yet. Not until 1862-63, when this famous blotter printed in 1948 comes to everyone's attention. And it comes also to the attention of Sam Folds, whom many of you will be aware of and know his work and probably knew him personally as well, possibly. In 1862 and 1863, the narrative begins to change. And the official, the guide from the U.S. Soccer Federation reprints that image and puts a little text at the bottom saying, essentially, that this was the first soccer organized club in the country in 1862-63. Now, this is changing the narrative. We still have an issue. We have a monument with an oval-shaped pigskin football. But about the same time in 1963, when the U.S. Soccer Federation is celebrating its 50th anniversary at this point, Sam Folds is participating at the General Assembly, the AGM of the Federation, and actually comments on the ball. In the minutes of the AGM from 1962-63, he is extolling the virtues of the game and saying we need to do more to promote the game among youth and young people across the country. And probably one of the things that's missing in our narrative, he says, is people don't realize that soccer has an old history. And Sam Folds goes on by saying that there is an old ball sitting in a museum in Otis House in Boston. And he says this ball is the evidence. It's the artifact, the original material that proves that we have a game that goes back to the 1860s. And he says anyone can go into Otis House and go and look at that. And so that artifact all of a sudden takes on a new meaning. Over the course of the next couple decades, the story of the Boston boys and the Oneida Club slowly begins to shift into a different historiography, the historiography of soccer and not just American football. So in the 1970s, there's a man named Alan Peterson who begins he founds actually the Massachusetts Youth Soccer Association, and he writes this little book about the guide to soccer in the state of Massachusetts, which includes a wonderful little historical section, which brings in the story that Boston has been prominent in American soccer since the early 1860s, when the boys of the high schools of Boston engaged in competitive play. So the story is slowly shifting in the 1970s. As we know, the 1970s has brought a real revolution to the place of the game in the cultural landscape, and it's become, through the highlight of the NASL, a big time sport. Everyone is aware of it, and so all of a sudden, the legitimacy for the game allows it to have a different story. Now, perhaps one of the key points here is in 1978, when Sam Folds publishes one of the first real attempts at having, most of you will know this book, America's Soccer Heritage, a real history of the game in the United States, which up until this point had not really yet been published and accessible to the public. He includes a chapter on Boston, and most particularly includes a picture of the monument. Now, what's fascinating, probably many of you have read this book and seen the chapter. I would encourage you to go back and look at it, because the image of the monument, of course, is the back side of the monument with the names. It's not the front side, which has the image of an inconveniently shaped oval ball. So the choice of using this image in the monument to illustrate the lineage from the Oneidas in the 1860s to soccer today in the 1970s was conditioned by the fact that, well, we can't show the monument because the monument's problematic. So what continues to happen in the 1980s, the National Soccer Hall of Fame, which is now up and running up in upstate New York, opens an exhibit in 1983-84. And that exhibit has on show, the star, which is the ball, from the very first organized association football game. Because of course, as we know, the game soccer has the name football in it. So we can sort of post-interpret Oneida Football Club as potentially the Oneida Association Football Club. Why not? That's convenient, isn't it? And so the National Soccer Hall of Fame obtains the ball on loan from Otis House and the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, and they get it on loan. And there's also there's a wonderful article that's printed up in the following months about the Oneidas, the first organized football team. So the narrative continues to grow. This again gets embedded into the projects of development for the National Soccer Hall of Fame over the late 1980s into the 1990s. As you can see, the ball is portrayed as a key artifact of American soccer history. You have Gerrit Smith Miller's portrait up at the top left about the traditions of the sport. And this is a really key way to illustrate and obviously solicit donations for the development of the ongoing National Soccer Hall of Fame and its growth. Now, finally, in 1994, the World Cup comes to the United States. And as we know, the World Cup brings an entire different focus of attention to the sport. And at this point, the National Soccer Hall of Fame contacts the city of Boston because the monument has fallen into disrepair. And the National Soccer Hall of Fame proposes to refurbish the monument. And very clearly stated to restore it to its actual original intention, which would have been a round ball, because the ball in the museum is round, of course. So the National Soccer Hall of Fame works with the city, and they finally get some support to refurbish the monument, to renovate it, and they recarve the image as a round soccer ball. Now, that takes a little bit of time after the World Cup. It's done in 1996. And it is inaugurated on the weekend of MLS Cup 96. And for those of you who remember 1996, that weekend, there was a big nor'easter. So it might be an explanation for why the inauguration didn't get really any coverage. Maybe there was an event, it was planned, but it didn't happen. But ultimately, it gets essentially no coverage in the press. That's the only bit from a newspaper in Boston, is that the New England the Hall of Fame in the New England Sports Museum will rededicate the monument, and that's all we get. Now, fast forward a number of years, at the end of the 1990s, a man named Tom McGrath, who is a Boston resident and a member of the Friends of the Public Garden and a concerned citizen, and he's a local teacher at one of the local institutes. I believe it's the Wentworth Institute. He has a student who is working on a history project and is struggling a little bit for the source of a topic to work on. And he says, well, why don't you go down to Boston Common and find this monument? There's a monument that's a football monument. And so the student walks down to Boston Common and comes back to Tom McGrath and says, well, I found a monument. It's to soccer. It's not to football. And Tom McGrath says, wait, what? I've been living in this city for years and years and years. And he walks down and he sees that, in effect, the monument had been changed and no one had really realized. And so Mr. McGrath did a whole lot of research about the Oneida Football Club at this time, came across all of the original material in the Boston City archives, etc., and went on essentially a citizen's crusade to restore the monument to what he believed was the authentic position in 1925, that is to say, an oval-shaped ball. That project ended in 2014 when they finally recarved the ball. You see here an image from the day that it was carved in September of 2014. And that brings us to today, where our monument, in the photo down here taken by Mike in 2017, now features an oval football. So ultimately, the story of this monument is the story of how history becomes history, how history is then manipulated, how it's usable, how it then essentially can be given multiple and diverging meanings, I suppose, in that sense. So maybe I'll just stop there and we can open up for some questions. I think we've gone about 20 minutes. But I hope everyone will enjoy the kind of twisted history. The book obviously covers the full story of the history of Boston, the Civil War, around the community of the Oneidas and how they grew into adulthood through Harvard, as well as their social networks and the Brahmin world that they lived in. But I thought tonight we would focus mostly on how the story actually became part of the soccer story, most specifically. So back over to you, Tom. Thank you very much.
All right. So now we want to thank them for those presentations, and we'll look for some Q&A. I'll go first to kind of break the seal here. You mentioned Sam Folds, one of the original chroniclers, historians, cheerleaders for American soccer history. He desperately wanted this to be a soccer game, right? On his stationery, it says 1862, the original football, right? So must have broken his heart when he found out, or maybe did he ever find out, that it wasn't the game? I know Roger Alloway, was, yes, I think this is a soccer game, and then has revised his approach. And now with your account, I think it sets the record straight. So, let's talk a little bit about Sam Folds and how maybe all of us wanted it to be soccer, but it's not.
Well, I suppose that's the fun part of the game is it exists in that in between time of early pre-codified sports, before the game is what we knew it was. And besides, anyway, between the 1860s and the 1880s and 90s and 1900s, the rules of these sports are changing continuously. So it's not that there is one fixed point at which a game can be considered, we say, oh, well, this is when soccer was invented. This is why, we tried to imagine this as inventing the Boston game. And in many respects, it's an a posteriori retrospective reinvention in that sense. But coming to your point about Sam, Tom, I think what's fascinating, Sam, as we know, he's an immigrant himself and was highly invested in the soccer community across the Northeast and in the country for many, many, many years. And obviously, he must have been confused in some sense with the fact that there's an artifact in a museum that clearly doesn't match the public record that's being promoted here on a monument, and asked all sorts of questions. Now, from the bits and pieces that we have left, I mean, I wasn't able, obviously, to do an interview with Sam Folds. He passed away right before the monument. I think right before the World Cup, actually, at the beginning of 1994. And so he never even saw the monument changed. Now, would he have wanted to see it changed to a soccer ball? I don't know. But clearly he was looking for, let's say, historical and cultural legitimacy for a game that he knew as popular on the cultural margins, largely up until the 1960s and 70s, that needed a story, that needed a narrative. And in many ways, it's very similar to some of the debates we go into this in the book about baseball, and we have some baseball fans here as well. But baseball's quest for a national story at the turn of the 20th century is embedded in a debate between Rounders and the British tradition and an American tradition. So the idea of having national cultural legitimacy, and that's something I think obviously someone like Sam Folds was desperately after, and was what the game was after in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s.
Wonderful. I mean, one follow-up there, most people here would have heard of Thomas Cahill, the father of American soccer. And he went on the record a number of times saying that he hoped World War I and soccer would develop like baseball did after the American Civil War. And one of the great things from your book, I believe, is how you have this kind of dead period where there is football in the Boston game, and then the war happens, and then it kind of reinvents or reemerges in the 1870s. I had never seen that before, and I think that is just one of the key contributions, in that timeline with, as Brian Bunk says, all types of football. So well done there. And I'll open it up. I don't see any virtual hands raised. I see David Kilpatrick. David, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you both, Michael and Kevin, for a session long overdue. Michael, in your comments early on, you were talking about Dixwell boys as Boston Brahmins. And my question is really, I suppose, about the naming of the club. And it's homage to Garrett Smith Miller's hometown. He was from Peterborough, and if you want to drive from Boston to Peterborough, you're gonna head west and turn south at Oneida, right? So it was an homage to his hometown, and you were talking about the myth making of baseball. Of course, he's linked with the first baseball diamond at Harvard too, right? So I've been very curious, and this goes back to being, I'm a local boy. I'm not that close from, or I'm not that far away from there right now. But the first time I ever went to the Hall of Fame in Oneida, I was really struck, like, wow, this is a real local claim. Like, to me, the artifact was a real legitimization of Oneida as a soccer town, and that, it's right up the road. They're the Oneidas. They must have been playing this locally. I don't know. That's what I remember thinking at the time. I'm wondering, again, that's the thing with any origins, right? The origins always have whatever going out there. I've done a little bit of digging into the Miller family and their origins. I'm wondering if either of you have, I mean, what a fascinating figure, but to me, maybe he is, Michael, maybe you're absolutely right. Maybe again, I don't know to what degree that's kind of a general thing for these Dixwell boys as Boston Brahmins, but I think of him as a dairy farmer, right? He was born and bred, and he died in the same village where he was born in upstate New York as a dairy farmer. And I think his greatest contribution to humanity was probably as a dairy farmer, I would imagine. But I just wonder if you've gone into his biography in particular. If you know, I'm guessing you guys might know a lot more about him. If you could talk about his life, if you could, or maybe that's just some thread somebody else may want to be picking up in the future.
Thank you. Oops. On Miller, I mean, you're absolutely right. The thing, if you read in the scientific journals, the thing he is famous for is introducing the Holstein cattle to America. And obviously their milk yield. And that's something he does with his brother. And his brother was also listed as playing on the Oneida team. So there's definitely a link with Miller there. I think in terms of, as you say, fascinating family, links to the abolition movement, very deeply involved in politics. I mean, if just Miller's, few things he wrote later on in life, he talks about the kind of, very hard politicians who are involved in anti-abolition, etc., who are coming to the house in Peterborough. So he's steeped in that tradition. He marries the daughter of his former school principal, Mr. Dixwell, Eves Dixwell. Dixwell, on some of his holiday, goes off and stays with his daughter and son-in-law, and sketches the Miller farm, etc. So those connections are very, very tight. I think you touch on an interesting point when you mentioned the baseball link, that there's 3 or 4 of these boys who are very active in early baseball. In some of the earliest teams in Boston, one of them plays in the first kind of exhibition game against what will become the best Boston Red Stockings, etc. And I always think when you look at the monument, first organized football club, I do wonder that I don't believe for a minute that in 1863 these were organized boys, apart from turning up and playing. Organized club denotes minute books and expenses and all kinds of things. I wonder if their notion of club comes from in their 20s when they're involved in organized baseball, and they kind of retrofit that organized football club. And I think that culture probably does a lot of their understanding of what sport will become, comes more from their adult engagement with baseball as a structure than it does necessarily from football. Miller's very interesting as well. He does go to Harvard, but he withdraws after a year due to ill health and moves back to Peterborough. So he's not one of those classic Harvard types, as you say. He lives in upstate New York. He's not a sort of Boston club animal who's hanging out with all the others. There was a brief moment, Kevin will remember the dates better than I, but there was a brief moment when they were talking about putting the Hall of Fame in Peterborough. And again, trying to tie the story very closely to Miller. On the Oneida name, you're right for the local thing, but I think also that relates to Miller. But also the one thing that predates, as it were, organized football at the college level is rowing. That rowing really emerges in the 1850s as the elite and very kind of manly college sport. And you look at the numbers who go to things like the annual Harvard-Yale matches that emerged at the time. The first boat that Harvard uses successfully is called the Oneida. So again, is the name Oneida a nod to where they all want to go in life, Harvard, or is it a nod to their captain and Garrett Miller? And the problem itself is the naming itself is an issue, because if you look at the small newspaper reports, and they literally are brief, 2 teams played, etc. If you look at them in the Boston transcript, etc., they usually refer to the name of the school or the principal. So Dixwell School is playing matches 1860, 1861, 1862 is referred to Dixwell. Suddenly 63, 64 is referred to as the Oneidas, and then goes back to being Dixwell's. So again, just that, because that overlays with the period where Miller is at the center of the team, we're back to the organized club debate. Does that identification come from Miller being a central figure? And I think he is so important to this team. He's also, the one interesting thing, I mean, they're friends through their life, that when you read their letters in the years before they die in the 1920s, dear teammate, you know, Miller is sending one of the less well-off guys boxes of vegetables from the farm in Peterborough down to Boston so he can eat fresh food, etc. They have a very tight bond. And I think the idea that Miller is kind of valorized as the captain, as the leader, as somebody who clearly was very significant to him. But yeah, I do wonder about what they learned from baseball and took into their memorialization.
Just want to follow up on that too, just the connections with the abolition movement and the, you know, he was a cousin of Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
That's right.
A really remarkable dairy farmer from upstate New York. Yeah. And I can't help but wonder, just as he was playing baseball in Peterborough before he went to Dixwell, if he was kicking a round ball around in upstate New York too. That's my belief.
Could have been.
Maybe I'll just chime in on the Hall of Fame bit to go a bit further on that, David. In effect, it was 1949 when the College Football Hall of Fame was trying to get put together, and they looked at 2 different places to do that. One was in New Brunswick at the home of our dear Tom McCabe's Rutgers University nearby. And then up in Cazenovia in New York, near because as far as I understand, Garrett Smith Miller was actually born in Cazenovia and then essentially lived in Peterborough, where his grandfather had founded the great-grandfather founded the town. But so in 1949, there's a big debate, and it's in the public, it's in the news. As to, there are 2 cities down to be named the Hall of Fame, and at the end of a course of a number of months, and the decision is made, it goes to New Brunswick and not to Cazenovia. Cazenovia, obviously, at that point was very, very close. For those of you who have ever been to the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, it's a short drive. And Cooperstown, the Baseball Hall of Fame at this point in the 1940s, is drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors a year. And so part of the idea is, wow, you know, this is a big deal. So why don't we do a Football Hall of Fame up there? Now, what ultimately happens is it's essentially there's no resources put behind it, and the Hall of Fame is essentially a name and nothing else, and some archives and boxes. Nothing actually materializes until many years later. But it's essentially a missed moment when the Oneida legacy and Garrett Smith Miller could have been placed on the national platform, which they don't get necessarily. They get risen up to a national level of recognition, but they kind of get bypassed. And I wonder to what extent actually that allows soccer to pull them back into their story as well. Now, there's a whole host of inconsistencies that we, and I mean, I won't go into the too much detail, but the way they play with their artifacts, as Mike was saying, you know, donating a ball and donating a scarf and all these things. Even the scarf, for example, is a direct, I think it probably is something that is invented out of the rowing tradition. There's no record of this famous red silk scarf before 1923. Even when they donate the ball in 1922, there's no record at what is today historic New England. There's no record that they donated a scarf. There's no record in the archives. There's no record in the bulletin. There's no record on the picture. I mean, you saw the picture. They're standing there with a ball. If you're donating something very important, wouldn't you put it in your picture? And the first time that the scarf comes into play is after 1923, when Harvard has published their big athletic history, and they have a huge discussion. There's even a whole chapter about the or the crimson, in this case, the crimson scarf, as a symbol of Harvard rowing and a symbol of Harvard sport. And so I wonder to what extent somebody in one of the Oneida families, remember they've extended this to now 52 of the elite Brahmin class. How many of them said, "Oh, well, didn't we must have worn this when we were playing football as well?" And maybe they did once or twice. But the idea that they actually had an official uniform with that is something that is invented or reinvented in 1923.
Thank you both.
Wonderful.
That's absolutely fascinating.
Other questions? I'll jump in as we wait for somebody else. So we've mentioned artifacts. So I'm going to, scrap the ball and the monument of all the sources you use to tell this tale, whether it's an artifact, newspapers, memoirs, contemporary histories, chronicles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What, maybe Kevin and Mike, what was your favorite source or surprise that you used to tell this story?
Go ahead, Mike.
I'll go. Yeah. The one I love most is the ball. And the ball is now in a storage unit belonging to Historic New England. And I drove up on a February afternoon and visited it. And it came out of its box and I was allowed to touch it. And it's now completely deflated. And it's obviously a rubber ball it's almost gone hard. It's almost like thin wood. And when you tap it, you can feel its hollowness. I'm always fascinated by the idea of the ball in the sense of when they donate it, the ball is, they claim, from a match they played in 1863. So when they donate it, it's 59 years old. Now, there is no record in anything we've looked at, be it correspondence, be it contemporary sources. There is nothing between 1863 and 1922 until they're suddenly like, oh, we've still got the ball. It's claimed it's in an outbuilding in Miller's house, but the ball has painted on it the Oneida crest, only one of 2 times it's used, the date of the match, who they played against, and then the names of the Oneida players. And then on one panel, as the times the 3 points were scored, the winning goals. But to me, the first time I looked at it, the calligraphy looks wrong. The lettering looks too 1920. It instantly became, if you go online, et cetera, one of those things, it instantly became the oldest football in the world. Older even than anything Rugby School had, made across the road by Richard Linden at the time. So in that sense, it's a remarkably powerful symbol, this round ball game being played on Boston Common in the middle of the Civil War, exactly the same year the FA has come into being in England. They're not playing with a rugby ball. Rugby's that bit older. 1863, the Big Bang moment, the FA, were they even aware the FA had been founded? But they come out with a round ball. And yet they love their round ball. when they make a monument to themselves, it's an American football. And they had their final dinner in 1927, and a poem's read called The Pilgrimage. There is only one copy of it. It's in Harvard libraries. We're not aware of any other copy ever having been printed and made. And the idea is one of the men, James Wolfe Lovett, the poem is him going into Otis' house to visit their bull and tell him that I'm gendering a bull. Anyway, tell the bull that it has become this powerful symbol because there's a monument now to the bull on Boston Common, and the bull puffs himself up and he's thrilled with himself and how he's going to live forever now. And in this poem, the bull asked de Wolfe Lovett a question: is it a good image? And de Wolfe Lovett has to say to the bull, I forget what the exact line, but it's a beautiful image. It's a perfect image of you. So he lies to the bull in this poem. And that last moment, their last lunch, when he reads this poem, it's where Kevin and I always felt that was where, are they admitting to the fact they've been playing fast and loose with history, fast and loose with their social standing? They can walk up to Harvard and say, I'm donating you a poem. And the Harvard archivists go, yes, sir, yes, because they're socially above them. And even they know, they admit they played with a round ball, but they're making a claim that they invented another type of football.
Yeah. Well, I think you picked, Mike, on probably my other favorite artifact, which is the poem itself. And I will never forget when I went to go see it it's accessible to anyone who goes into Harvard Library. You just get yourself a reader's card, you walk in and you can request it. But there is, as Mike said, there's only one copy, and it's this beautiful, bound copy with a sky blue cover, and the printing is really nice. And it's the kind of thing you imagine they must have printed, I don't know, maybe 10 of them just for the 7 people who were at the dinner and maybe a couple people in the families. And that poem, but since that poem is essentially the key, and what's fascinating is that poem is not available anywhere online. It's never been written up. You find nothing. I found it simply looking through the library archives. And when you read it, all of a sudden, it's the key that unlocks all of this hidden messiness with history and this manipulation. And there's a question of, that's why, to give you a sense, we almost called the book The Great Football Hoax. But since we weren't 100% convinced, we're not sure, not 100% convinced of it, but there's a sense where they're admitting that they are playing with history. So the poem itself is certainly a wonderful piece. And then I guess the other bits would be just the correspondence that is written between these team members. That they're scattered all across the Boston archives and historical societies, but the way they write to each other, there is such an incredible sense of friendship of people who have been friends, lifelong friends for 70 years. And I think that's one of the things that came out the most as Mike and I struggled really to try and understand, why were they doing this? What was all this about? I mean, clearly there's a sense of we want to claim a place for ourselves in history. And at this point, in the 1920s, when they're that old, basically, Boston is celebrating its tercentenary of the 1620 of the Plymouth Landing. Boston is key. There's huge changes to the country, to the city, and immigration. The Brahmin class and their position in society is being revisited, and everyone is saying we need to preserve our past and our heritage. And these men, who, as Mike alluded to before, Miller went to Harvard but only stayed for a year. Of the 5 who were key to the monument endeavor, if you will, there's only one who would have essentially been famous after this. If they had not done the monument, only one would have been known afterwards, and that's Peabody, because he was a Harvard professor, a social reformer, and he was a big guy. The rest of them, even Miller, who, yes, was well known in the cattle industry, he was only well known outside a very narrow niche after 1923 because of the recognition that was given to him because of the football stuff. And it's actually only when they recognize him in 1923 that his name gets put on a list of honorary degree recipients at Harvard in 1924. So he gets himself an honorary degree from the school that he wasn't able to graduate from. Now there's three others, particularly two of whom who were not in the 1% by the end of their lives, and that's Lovett and Arnold. And the two of them, who were very big baseball players in the 1860s and 70s, but the of the remaining three, those three don't have they don't have any recognition in sport either. And if you remember there in 1923, I mentioned this book, this huge 600-page encyclopedia of Harvard sport. And if you imagine the importance, obviously, in university sport at this point of having a letter, of being a lettered athlete. And in their correspondence, there's one letter that is probably, I guess that's maybe my favorite artifact, is this one letter that admits that they are now crowning Gerrit Smith Miller as, after having publicly said, no, we're not doing this for ourselves. But they recognize that, well, Gerrit Smith Miller has now gotten a degree. This is our athletic birthday, they call it, November 7 and November 21 in 1863 and then in 1925. And so they go back to that, and as a thank you, actually, to the one of their friends, they give him a watch fob. So that's one of these little hanging things that hangs on a pocket watch. That is a gold lapis lazuli beautiful piece that I've never seen a picture of because it's a personal item that was given. But they recognize each other, and their friendship is really kind of the key leitmotif that drives the entire project all the way through. Even if they're looking for some recognition and for some athletic recognition and scholarly recognition, but as Mike said, they're taking care of each other as old men all the way to the end, sending each other, paying for each other's medical bills, sending food. It's a fascinating story of real boyhood friendship that they maintain all the way into their 80s.
I also think it's really fascinating in terms of, the amnesia that plagues the game here, right? I mean, how would they have known about the FA? Well, they could have been reading the Clipper or any number of the kind of transatlantic sport periodicals. And, the Clipper tells us, that in 1860, there was a Union Football Club of Boston that had been playing for a couple of years. That had like 24 members, right? But to your point earlier, Michael, right? Maybe these weren't influential people. That's the thing. Like even the dairy farmer Miller is extraordinarily connected with historical personages. I mean, like again, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's his cousin. He brings the Holstein cow, like, for an upstate New York dairy farmer who didn't graduate from college, pretty remarkable person. But the amnesia, right? I mean, who were the members of the Union Football Club? Who are these 24 members, and why were they just completely forgotten and nobody spoke up? That's the other thing that really blows my mind, right? Of all the football clubs that we knew were going on around the New York City area, and that there was stuff going on, but it wasn't even the first football at Harvard, right? I mean, we know that the Delta Plaza or whatever it was, that the classes would play some form of football. I really like your theory, Michael. It seems to me like part of your theory is these guys are saying, well, we did a new type of football, or that this is a club, a different kind of conception, right? That it's almost like a governance nuance that they were sensitive to, rather than this more general claim that could be easily debunked by anybody saying, well, wait a second, we did that a few years before, maybe even on the same patch of grass. You think they were jumping on a bandwagon at a particular time, and enough time had transpired that kind of amnesia had set in? Or, I mean, I guess I'm just wondering what you guys think about that in terms of, now with the digital archives of things, we can find out so much more about these other things. So, again, the first time I saw this ball, I didn't think there was anything to question about whether it was the first football club. I mean, like, you just didn't even, it was like, wow, that's great. Now, years later, it seems like we're rediscovering so much more almost every day. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that in terms of any Bostonians that could have said, hey, wait a second, much less people in other cities who are clearly organizing clubs.
I think the one interesting thing about the Oneidas and the way they memorialize themselves, and they come up with a team roster, and you can look at the biographies of 52 boys who became men. They were the team. So we've got that. Whereas clearly, you know, their idea, they were the first organized team. Well, if you're playing against somebody at the same time, they're also first. And yet the names of all the other schoolboy teams, they've gone to the winds of time. So I think it is important that what it gives us, no matter how playfully they did it, it gives us a sense of the type of boy who was playing football on the common in the 1860s. We know from the results in the papers, they are the elite schools they're playing against. So we know those schools are the similar types of boy. I think what's critical is 1865, the team is, according to Monument, done. The critical point is they've all gone off to Harvard. So they're moving on. It's also the year of Reconstruction. They come from serious families. They're going to get on with their life. Critically, in their period at Harvard, the second half of the 1860s, there's no football allowed at Harvard. It had been banned in the 1860s. But you do get in there some of their written accounts and also some mentions in the newspapers that Harvard graduates are leaving Cambridge, are going back to the common to play their boyhood game. So there is a lineage where within the ferment of Boston, boys, young men are used to playing this game. So it does continue. My hypothesis, I might be completely wrong, is that once you get into that discussion about which game the elite colleges are going to play that will become American football, Harvard hangs hard on the idea that it's their game, the Boston game, plus what they've seen of rugby when they play McGill. That the Boston game is kicking and handling, they clearly like rugby, and that's pushing against Yale, etc.'s insistent that it's going to be soccer. And I just wonder whether that's kind of in that Harvard-Yale ferment. It's just a little victory for Harvard that they dictate because they're older and better and wiser and more famous. But I think what does eventually then emerge that Walter Camp obviously changes dramatically is that sense that it's not simply a Harvard game, because there was 10 years where there wasn't a Harvard game. There was a ban and a civil war. So we have to take a step back. Where's that game? Boston Common, round ball, kicking and handling. So interesting.
Yeah, thank you, David, for the question as well. I'll pick up your bit about the amnesia and their knowledge or not of footballing history, the FA, etc. Some of the interesting things is just to see their evolving understanding and their evolving intent. And I think that's one of the things that was the hard, if I can talk about what was very difficult in writing the book, was wrapping our heads around the fact that where they were in 1906 when they began to commemorate, and they had a dinner and they published a book and they had a ball, but they hadn't done anything with it. It's just they made a book for themselves. And then 10, almost 15, almost 20 years later, when they donate, and then they begin a commemorative process that lasts, 2 years, that is a continuously evolving set of motivations and intents, and it sort of compounds. And that probably is what comes out the most in the poem is them finally admitting, you know what, we started completely with the truth. We, we did our donation. We were preserving the past. We were doing heritage in many ways. And then as we start to commemorate, well, then, there's a little bit of hyperbole comes into play, and then it becomes a little bit stretched and this and that. And by the time you get to 1925, well, they're really playing with it. And when they are so insistent about having their oval ball, well, then they know that's not exactly what they were doing. But, they say, well, we were the lineage, in the same way that, you're looking at this, from an evolutionary standpoint. And I think that is clear. One of the key things is in 1926, when they put up the list of the 52, and that's the document that everybody knows. It's online. It's on archive.org. It's the An Historical Sketch of the Oneida Football Club. And it is full of problems. I mean, we go into the book. So there's problems with doctored photographs. I won't give things away because it's all in the book. But one thing they do clearly say in 1926 is they are fully aware that the FA was founded in 1863, because they say very clearly, we were actually before them. And so it's fascinating They know that, and they even know this, much earlier on, because they're in some of their writing at the beginning of the 20th century. They're aware of the history. They know what's going on. They just haven't, since they haven't decided to place themselves into the historiography. They don't play with it yet. But finally, when they get to the end, there's a sense of, oh, we know exactly what we're doing. And maybe just the last word on the rowing bit, that gap in the 60s and 70s, as Mike was talking about, one of the key things that we certainly learned in doing the research was, when the colleges begin to play in, between that 1872 and 1875 period, and they're choosing what to play. Do they play rugby? Do they play soccer? And, there's that moment. One thing that is fascinating is that the people who found the Harvard Football Club and who play on the Yale football team there's crossover between them and the rowing teams. And in 1873, 74, particularly at the rowing regattas between the two schools, there are some absolutely horrendous incidents, which are, people are saying, oh, well, Harvard, you cheated, and Yale, you cheated. And there is some real bitterness between the two schools through rowing. And so, and the chronology follows this very nicely. 6 months after this horrible rowing event in the spring of, I think it's 74, is when the first invitations get sent. And Harvard says, no, we're not coming to your meeting because I remember what you did to me on the water 6 months ago. And we sometimes when we look back at history, we forget the interpersonal aspects of these things. And I'm guessing that simply this was just a grudge between people who hadn't, who were, angry about their participation in another sport. So quite funny.
A final question before we wrap up from someone? I'll end with, they called that the Great Harvard Snub, right? They meaning the soccer folks, 1876, I believe. Bob Gansler on the call, myself, went to one of those other universities, Princeton University, and if you saw me give up 5 goals against Harvard in my freshman year, you would have called it the Great Harvard Flubs. So we'll ask Brian to edit that out of the podcast. But really just wonderful. You remind me of one of my favorite quotes of a historian, Simon Schama. History is the study of the past in all its splendid messiness. You've done a splendid job research and writing about a messy chapter in American sport history, So a wonderful contribution. And thank you very much. Before we wrap up and say goodbye, I'm just going to kick it over to Kevin. He has a final word or two about some anniversaries.
Thank you, Tom. I did also want to just also extend a massive thank you to everyone in SASH, because this book and this project and this research was going on for years. Benefited so much from so many people in SASH, from people that have written stuff, on all aspects that touch on bits and pieces of the story. People that we discussed with, that shared, that I shared bits of writing with. The book that came out a couple years ago, Chris and George's book on Soccer Frontiers. That was a wonderful opportunity to develop this writing. So without SASH, we never could have done this book, I have to say. And then just to close, I wanted just to announce and invite anybody, if you are in the Boston area, in 2 weeks' time, since that is the 100th anniversary. Not just today is the anniversary of the ball, but in 2 weeks' time will be the anniversary of the monument on November 21. That will be 100 years since its unveiling in 1925. So we're going to be doing a number of events actually that week in Boston. We'll be giving a book talk at Massachusetts Historical Society on Tuesday the 18th. There'll be a panel and some ceremony session on Thursday and Friday that week with the Friends of the Public Garden. So if you're in the Boston area, feel free to come along on all of that. And then thank you very much, Tom.
You're welcome. And thank you to all the folks who participated in today. and for the folks who will listen in the future. Just another wonderful chapter in American soccer history. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think James will stop.